Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Yes, 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 it's me again. This is the double header for this Wednesday for Podcasters Live. If you missed it earlier, we had Crystal Profit on, and we spoke about leveraging your live stream and your video to grow your podcast. Tonight, we have who I consider the statesman of the podcast industry. And I'm going to say something. It'll probably just fall on, or the Americans will probably just get this one. But there's a commercial back in the day, and it was for a finance company. It was called E.F. Hutton. I don't know if you guys remember that or not, but you would hear people talking. They would be in a busy restaurant, and they would just be talking. And then someone would say, "Hey, I heard from E.F. Hutton," and guess what? Everyone else would stop, and they would listen to what E.F. Hutton would have to say. James Cridland is just like that from a podcast industry standpoint. When he has something to say, people listen, the industry listens. Everybody should take note. So before we get into talking to James, let's go ahead and hit the intro. So the podcast industry has grown by leaps and bounds over just the last 18 to 24 months exponentially, where more and more people are actually getting into this medium of podcasting and wanting to learn actually how to do it. But I think one of the things that most podcasters need to really understand is the industry itself, not just the way to do podcasting, not just the editing of the podcasting, the hosting and all these things. You actually need to understand a little bit more about the industry of podcasting. And our guest tonight, James Cridland, he is the editor of Podnews and also Podland. Podnews is a daily podcast that talks about the industry and all the things that are actually going on. And we're going to talk to him about that as well. But then he also has Podland, which is a weekly podcast that he does with his co-host Sam Sefi, and it's an amazing podcast that comes out every Thursday. So make sure you guys are looking at that. So let's go ahead and introduce Mr. James Cridland. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good. Good morning from Brisbane in Australia, where I am. I'm busy having my morning coffee and watching the sun.
You're watching the sun. Excellent. Well, we were joshing earlier with, I've heard James. I listen to him every day and then also every week, and try to catch some of his speeches at different conferences and things like that. And we were talking about his microphone, the Death Star. So he has an amazing.
Holding my tiny little microphone. So so my house is being redecorated at the moment and renovated and stuff. I have a beautiful microphone, not quite as beautiful as yours, but nearly getting there. But I have learnt that carrying expensive microphones around is not a good plan. So this is my little travel microphone, and it kind of does a kind of okay job. So
it sounds great,
even if it does look like the Death Star. So, but still, there we are.
It's Death Star, compared, contrast with Darth Vader a little bit there too. So you got a kind of thing going on. So James, I did a little quick intro, about you, but I would love people to hear in your own words, just what it is that you do, your podcast that you have, and also how long you've actually been in this industry, because I think that's important as we set the stage for everything else.
Yeah, Steve. Oh, well, thank you so much, Steve. And thank you for inviting me on as well. I really appreciate it. So Podnews is a daily newsletter and a daily podcast, which focuses on the news going on in the podcast industry. Big news today with Spotify buying 2 podcast analytics companies, which we might come back to a little bit later on.
Yes.
I've been doing that for the last nearly 5 years. So started doing that in 2017. It was actually... the idea came to me in a pub in Los Angeles. I was chatting with a friend of mine, and they were saying, "Where do you get your news about podcasting?" And I said, "There isn't anywhere really, is there?" And he said, maybe you should fix that." And so that's basically how I got into this. But I've actually been in podcasting and the audio industry for a long, long time. I launched the first daily podcast from a radio station back in January of 2005 in the UK. So that was before Apple had put podcasting into the iPod at the time. So long, long, long time ago. And have been involved in audio and podcasting, ever since, including working at the BBC and at various places across Europe, North America, and here in Australia.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, James, one of the questions I always start with, because I think it just sets the tone for everything else that we talk about, is there are probably 2 to 3 different people or, teams, if you will, when I ask this question and gets a different answer, of course. Like, so in your perspective, in your opinion, like, what is a podcast?
Oh, great. Thank you for giving me that one.
Yeah, that was coming.
The first thing. So 3 answers to what is a podcast. There's a technical answer, which is it's to do with an RSS feed. It's a piece of audio, normally could be video, delivered via an enclosure in an RSS feed. That's a very deeply boring technical answer. If you ask people and you go out and do market research, as many people have done, and you say, where do you listen to your podcasts? Actually, places like YouTube appear very high. And particularly when you ask people in countries like Germany and countries like France and in other places, then YouTube is the number 1 place where people are consuming podcasts. If they think that that's podcasting, well, great. Let them think that that's podcasting too. My definition is a little bit easier. My definition is that it's an audio first medium. So it might have video attached to it, but the audio should work alone. And it's on demand. So it's like a radio show, but on demand. And that's basically the definition that I go by, because I think actually at the end of the day, if you tell someone that's just watched, not that you can watch Joe Rogan anymore, but if you tell somebody that's just watched Joe Rogan on YouTube that they haven't been watching a podcast, then they'll look at you and get very confused. And I don't think that's particularly helpful to any of us. So from my point of view, a podcast is a piece of audio first entertainment that is, or information that is available on demand, and that's basically what a podcast is.
Excellent. And now you've recently actually started uploading Podnews up to on the YouTube. What made you actually want to go that route as well?
Well, I felt to myself that there was a way of automating. What I'm very big on doing is automating as much as possible. And I figured out a way of automating, a way of taking the audio that I put together for the Podnews podcast every single day. And I figured out a way of doing that so that it ended up being automatically uploaded onto YouTube. So, and I've actually written an article on how to do that. And I figured that it might not get very many people. The YouTube algorithm doesn't like static images or fake video, as other people call it. But there again, it does get some people. And, typically, I'm getting 100,000 downloads a month. Typically, every episode is getting about 10, 15 views on YouTube. Now, that might be 10 or 15 views that I'm not getting, everywhere else. So that's important. And on the other side, there's a bunch of research, and I think particularly a piece of research done for the Canadian podcast listener research, which asked the question: how do you use podcasts in YouTube? Do you go back again and again and again and watch podcasts in YouTube? Or do you subscribe to that podcast in your favorite podcast app once you find it in YouTube? And the answer was 71% of people actually will subscribe to a podcast in their podcast app once they've found a new podcast on YouTube. So it's a great promotional tool, even if it's not particularly good for additional views. That's certainly been my experience anyway.
Yeah, and I think when we first chatted, we were talking about, I was telling you a little bit about Podcasters Live and what we're trying to do here. And I think one of the things you spoke about was, the idea of discovering the podcast, using live stream and things like that, but the consumption happening somewhere else, right? Because I think that's where, no podcaster, I was just talking to Crystal Prophet earlier about this, no podcaster who starts a podcast will ever say, I don't want you to listen to my podcast, right? They started
Yeah.
so that people can listen to it and consume it. But I feel it's not so much the starting of the podcast; it's the actual discoverability of the
Mm,
podcasting.
mm.
So, what's your thoughts on discoverability, and what is the industry doing differently, or should be doing to help from that standpoint?
Yeah, and you say that no podcasters don't want you to listen to their show. I got a 3-page lawyer's letter the other day from a podcaster who said the only place that my show can be is on Apple Podcasts, and you should not be linking to it.
Wow.
Okay. Cease and desist, and a DMCA request and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, so there are people out there who don't want you to listen.
Wow. Okay. All right. I stand
Surprisingly
corrected.
enough, I wouldn't recommend that as a plan.
No, not at all.
But yeah, but anyway, yeah, I mean, I think, discovery is a really important thing, and how people find your show, is, could be all kinds of different ways. And, a way of people finding your show could be just the fact that you tweet about it or you put it on LinkedIn or that
Mhm,
sort of
mhm.
thing. That is a great funnel to get people in, but to get people to subscribe either to the newsletter, which is what I would like you to subscribe to at podnews.net, or
Right,
subscribe
right.
to the podcast audio as well. So discovery happens all over everywhere. And I think there's a lot of talk at the moment around podcast apps and the discoverability within
Mhm.
podcast apps, and is it good enough, and blah blah blah. Well, actually, how much discoverability actually happens within podcast apps anyway?
Mm.
But normally, the highest amount of podcast discoverability is word of mouth, but it's also a lot of off-platform stuff as well. And I think we should probably, be looking at that and making sure. One of the big mistakes that many podcasters make is they'll link to their podcast on Apple Podcasts.
Mm.
Now, by all means, link to your podcast on Apple Podcasts. That's a good thing. But don't forget that 70% of the world uses Android, and there
Come on.
isn't an Apple
Yes.
Podcasts for Android. So what you're doing by sharing your a link directly to Apple Podcasts is that you're annoying all of those Android users. You're annoying people that would prefer to listen on Spotify or on other platforms like Pocketcasts or Overcast or whatever it is. So always, always, always make sure that you're linking to ideally your own website. And if you don't have a website, then go and use a service like podpage.com, which will give you a website for your podcast automatically, and use that rather than sharing to the lovely people at Apple or the lovely people at Spotify or whoever it is. Make sure that you're sharing so that share works for absolutely everybody, and that's a really important thing.
Oh, that's a great point. I think the tendency is because you start to go with the biggest name, if you will, that
Mm.
they're going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. If I put my podcast just on Apple, they're Apple, and guess what? I think it's just going to happen for me. I'm going to be able to get, you said something, you kind of glossed over it, but it's an amazing number. 100,000 downloads per month. You said
Yeah, yeah,
for
100,000 downloads a month. Which is quite a thing. A lot of that, because it's only a 3-minute long podcast, very, very short.
consumption.
This is me demonstrating very, very short. If you're watching the video, I'm not quite sure why I was doing that.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah, because it is a very short podcast. It works really well on things like Google News and Amazon Alexa flash briefings and stuff like that. So actually, that's a way that quite a lot of people have a listen to it. They'll have a listen to that podcast when they've caught up with the latest news headlines or whatever, and they might be doing that in the shower in the morning or whatever. But that's been really interesting. I think that's very different to Podland, which is a normal hour-long show, which has very different audiences, to that, and that, of course, you couldn't consume in that sort of a way. So I think again, different things for different shows is always interesting to see.
Agreed. And what's your thought around, the actual listening patterns? Has it changed from, let's say, when you started podcasting to now, relative to, when individuals are
Mm.
consuming it? Is there something different? Is there something that podcasters need to kind of think about as they start to craft their show as well?
Mm. Well, I mean, my background, my long historical background has been in the radio business, and one of the things that really works in terms of radio is habit. It's the habitual thing of waking up in the morning, listening to your favorite breakfast show, whatever it is that you listen to. When you get in the car, the radio is on and it's your favorite radio station, and so on and so forth. Habit is a really important thing for audio consumption. And so making that habit work in terms of podcasting is what a lot of people are working on right now, which is why the New York Times Daily is so successful, because it's a daily podcast. It replaces, if you like, that breakfast show that you weren't listening to particularly. It replaces that and gives you some really good content within 20 minutes or so. So shows like that are using habits there are making a big change in terms of how podcasting, is actually going, which is why any podcaster that is doing a great job will always have a very consistent release time. So both release time in the day, but release day of the week, so that people know when your next show is going to come out, that people will, set their watches by it. And it confuses people if you don't follow that particular consistency. That's why you see a lot of reruns, for example, for shows like, Freakonomics Radio. If they don't have a show that week, then they will rerun something so that there is a show that week, and quite a lot of people won't have heard it. So to those people, it's brand new content anyway. The consistency is a really important thing.
Oh, that's a great point around the habit, right? Because when you start to think about, who's consuming your content and your audience, they are listening for something pretty specific, from you. And so if you break that trend, or if you break that, like say you have pillars for your content that you kind of go after, and you kind of break that habit, and you start to go and start talking about Bitcoin, and you've never spoke about Bitcoin before, they're like, what's going on? And so I think that habit piece is something that I don't think a lot of podcasters, even myself included, until you brought it up, actually thought about. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
No, consistency is a really important thing. Yeah.
It is. And if you're out there, if you have a question or a comment, please don't hesitate to make sure you go and put it in the chat or comments as well, and we'll make sure we get that to you as well. So here's another question I think I wrote it when I gave it to you. Said this is another loaded one around downloads, right? Because you stated around, of course, with your podcast is around, not around, it's 100,000 downloads a month, and someone who's listening to this, they'll be like, oh my God. How can I get there? When they just started, it just started yesterday, and they're like, can I get that within the next month? No, you can't.
No,
not whatsoever. Not whatsoever. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but it's just not going to happen. But there is not even the argument, but the discussion around downloads and the impact that it actually has on maybe the podcaster's ability to produce the content, because they get so fixated on it and they actually forget about like creating really great content consistently. What say you relative to the whole download argument, and your thoughts on that as well?
Well, I mean, downloads is a really interesting metric. It's the only metric really that podcasting has overall. We don't necessarily know the number of listeners that we have. We don't necessarily know, we know a bit about where they are, but it's very, blurry data, if you like. The one thing that we do know is how many podcasts have been downloaded from our server. But even that is actually not that useful, because a show can be downloaded but never listened to. If you use Overcast, for example, as your podcast app, then Overcast will sit and download new shows for you literally until your phone fills up. It never stops. So you don't know that those are being actually listened to, and that's fine. Apple Podcasts has a slightly different approach. What Apple Podcasts does is, once you've stopped listening to a show, it will stop downloading it. I think you've got 3 or 4 episodes to go and have a listen to before Apple Podcasts essentially stops. But what that also means is that, even with Apple Podcasts, there is a percentage of shows which are downloaded, which are never listened to. there was a bug earlier on last year,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
ended up showing actually that the figure for Apple Podcasts was somewhere in the region of 30% of all downloads weren't being listened to. Now, if you're an advertiser, that's fine. It's already priced into the price that you're paying to advertise on a podcast. But that's a thing just to bear in mind. So I think from my point of view, the important thing is to watch the trends, not necessarily watch the numbers. Are you going up? Are you going up consistently? If you're coming down, why is that? You should
Mm-hmm.
be able to go back and work out what it is that you changed that is harming your figures, or what is it that you changed that is making your figures grow more, and actually look more at the trend rather than the actual numbers will really help. But at the end of the day, that's one way of seeing how successful your podcast is. Another way is how many, if you're podcasting for a business, how many people mention that podcast when they're working with you, how many pieces of email you get, all of that kind of stuff. How many people are following your Twitter handle? All of that kind of stuff is also really important in terms of just measuring how well your podcasts are going.
Yeah. How often are you using, social media to help push people um, to your podcast? Because I think that's the other piece when we start talking. I just want to kind of correlate it with downloads, because the marketing side of
Mm,
it, because
mm,
that's the
mm,
piece that a lot of people fail. They that old adage of build it or publish it and it will come, and they will come, and it's just not that, and they fail to do the other side of that. How much of your overall, I guess, workflow, if you will, is spent not just creating the content, but making sure that people know about it, and then actually kind of pushing them towards
mm.
that content?
I mean, I automate as much as I possibly can. If you're writing a daily newsletter about podcast news, then it's kind of important to make that as easy as possible. Otherwise, it'll send you mad. And so I automate. I'm very lucky that I learned how to code at school
Hmm.
on computers like Commodore PETs or VIC-20s, or computers that if you had color, you were lucky. So I learned how to do that, and that's been really useful because that has allowed me to automatically, for example, tweet as soon as I've published a new story, to automatically to build, jobs boards, and to build events boards and stuff like that to help the industry too. So that's been really helpful. And one of the ways that I found particularly useful is if I'm talking about somebody, if I'm writing about someone,
Hmm.
then to tweet the fact that they are in today's
Hmm.
today's episode,
Hmm.
and to reference their Twitter handle in my particular case, so that they see that, because quite a lot of people will then retweet their mention, assuming that it was a positive mention, will retweet their mention, and then that's then putting your podcast in front of loads of other people as well. So doing that kind of thing is really important too. So yeah, I mean, I try and automate as much as I can, and
Hmm.
also, I'm over 50 now, so things like TikTok, no idea how any of that works. So I steer well clear of that sort of thing. But Facebook, Twitter, I'm hopefully relatively good at. I would say also on the other
Hmm.
side, that using things like Facebook and Reddit, subreddits, and those sorts of things is a really good place to find new stories,
Hmm.
and to
Yep.
watch what people are talking about in terms of the problems that they have, and whether or not there are ways that you can solve that by clearing something up as part of a story, or whatever it is. So actually, it's not a one-way street. It's not going out and spamming social media with as much of your stuff as possible. Actually,
Correct.
quite a lot of it is helping other people, and and moving on from that sort of side. And that's certainly something that I found really, really useful.
Excellent. So you heard it here first. James Cridland is going to do a TikTok tonight video and put it out there. He was inspired by Podcasters Live conversation. Just I'm
No
gonna
idea, no idea how any of that works. No idea.
but myself included, and my visual my virtual assistant, she keeps telling me to do it, and and she got me to do reels and stuff like that for retail leadership with Steve Worthy and stuff like that. But I said, TikTok, I don't have the time. I just don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't. James, there's this thing you speak about it a lot on Podland
Mm.
and Podnews, and it is podcasting, 2.0, right? So we can talk about
Yes.
podcasting 2.0, but before we talk about podcasting 2.0, what was podcasting 1.0? Because I think that's probably where the majority of people live, but I do want to talk about 2.0 as well.
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen in terms of podcasting over the last 15 years is that Apple saw podcasting as being a really good way of filling the iTunes music store with stuff that wasn't music and stuff that was free and stuff that was available in every country in the world. And so that's why Apple jumped in and thought, well, podcasting looks like a good idea. We'll do that. And one of the things that Apple did is they were a good custodian of podcasting. They
Mm,
kept the whole thing open. They did a few useful things in terms of setting a standard category list, requiring podcast thumbnails to be the size and the shape that they are, and all of that kind of stuff. And Apple did a really good job in 2005 of setting the standards down so that when you were in the Apple Podcasts directory, those standards were set and away you go. And then Apple sat on their hands basically for
mm,
15 years, and they've made very few changes. They've made a few, but they've made not that many changes in terms of the fundamentals of how podcasting works.
mm,
And so what podcasting 2.0 is all about is it's about taking the standard RSS feeds that we use,
mhm,
adding more information to those RSS feeds to add more features and more functionality into podcasting. And so, from a Podcasters Live point of view, one of the things that is currently being worked on is the opportunity of being able to press a button and tell everyone who is listening to your podcast that you are going live right now. And you can instantly see that in your podcast app, as one example. Another example is Transcripts. Which
mhm,
bizarrely podcasting doesn't have a standard way of doing that yet within the RSS feed. Well, now there is a standard way as part of podcasting 2.0. And there are many other of these new tags that people are working on to really breathe new life into RSS and to allow it to do many more things
mhm.
for the benefit of podcasting. So podcasting 1.0 is where most of us currently are, and podcasting 2.0 will actually enable a lot of new and interesting things in terms of podcasting.
Excellent. And then one of those interesting things, we could talk about the podcasting app, but the one that has always I've been interested in exploring, and I haven't explored it
Mm.
yet, and I should, is the idea of value for value. I know Adam Curry and those guys have really kind of taken the lead on that. If you could explain what value for value is, because I think some people, as I had conversations with them, I think they misconstrue it for monetization, and I'm not particularly sure it is monetization. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would love to get your perspective on value
Mm.
for value
Mm.
and have clear that up for us.
So, one of the problems when you're making a podcast and you get it sponsored is that you have a relationship with the sponsor, you have a relationship with the advertiser. The advertiser is paying you money. And so, therefore, it kind of, if the advertiser, so at the moment, Podnews is being sponsored by Libsyn, and Libsyn is a great podcast company, and they are sponsoring Podnews for this month, and that's very kind of them. If there is a negative story about Libsyn that appears, then there is a question about, should I really be covering this because Libsyn are paying for the newsletter this month? Is this a good idea? And in my case, I would still cover it because well, why not? But you can see many people would find that quite compromising, and particularly if you end up saying lots of things that advertisers don't like, then you'll find it quite difficult to get hold of advertisers. So the point of value for value in the overall thing is to is to take away funding from advertising, which is editorially constraining, and move that to your audience. If your audience finds what you do valuable, then ask them for some money, or ask them for some support, or for some value back. And so that might be, giving me $5 on PayPal. That might be doing, that might be, I don't know, doing some smart branded clothing, or all kinds of things, but giving me some value back, that is recognizes the value that I give that particular person.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the overall value for value thing. And Adam Curry has been living, literally, it's been paying his wages for the last 5 years or so, just asking the listeners to his shows, if you get value from this, we would really appreciate some value back again. Now, what Podcasting 2.0 is additionally doing is they're building stuff into podcast apps, which gives very small amounts of money as you listen to a podcast to the podcaster. And allows you to donate more. They're called boosts, and allows you to donate more to a podcaster if you want to. It uses cryptocurrency rather than normal, dollars and pounds and things, because it's much easier to do very small payments using that sort of thing. But that's a really interesting way of seeing value from listeners go straight to the podcaster without any third party in the middle of that, and could really help you if you were worried about the type of content that you have on your show, of whether advertisers want to be there. I mean, even now you can have a look at some really popular podcasts out there which are all about true crime, and all about horrendous crimes that about cutting people up and all this kind of thing. Surprisingly enough, there are lots of advertisers that do not want to go anywhere near those sorts of stories when they're advertising. So there might be fantastically large shows,
Correct.
but they're cutting off an awful lot of sponsorship money from doing that. Value for value is where that really benefits you, because you're going straight to the listener rather than having this random advertiser in the middle of that relationship.
Yeah, I actually like that, because now you are you are identifying, with someone's content and it resonates with you so much that you feel that, wow, I can actually give them something that will benefit them, because what they just said or gave me benefited me. I don't have to, go buy a gift card. I don't have to kind of go to PayPal. I can actually, if I'm within the cryptocurrency or have an app, or have the ability to, send someone Satoshis and things like that, then I can actually do that. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you have a bet with Adam Curry or something along those lines, that if Apple is going to go into Android or something along that line. What's the ongoing thing between you and Adam Curry? I had to pull that out of you.
Yeah. So I said last year, that Apple Podcasts won't be stupid. They do understand that 70% of people out there use Android phones rather than iPhones. And now that Apple Podcasts is earning money from selling subscriptions to podcasts, which is a very valid other way of earning money, now that Apple Podcasts is earning money through that, and they keep 30% of the money that podcasters make that way, it's in Apple's interest to launch Apple Podcasts on Android. And I said that would happen last year. I did promise Adam that if I was wrong, I would pay him 100,000 sats, which is somewhere like $60 or so. Not that much, but anyway. And I lost that bet, but I've gone for the bet again for this year, because I can't believe that Apple is going to be stupid enough to leave 70% of the world's mobile phone base alone, when they could be earning money from selling podcast advertising, from podcast subscriptions. They've never done that before. They haven't done that in the last 15 years. So it's made no sense for them. I think it does make sense for them now. There's an Apple Music app for Android, an Apple TV app for Android. There's no reason why there shouldn't be an Apple Podcasts app, either. So I fully expect one this year, I think.
Excellent, excellent. We have a great question. I was actually thinking about the same thing. How long do you think it will take until the podcasting 2.0 is normal state of podcasting? Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Cher. Thank you for that. And I think the quick answer is, what is podcasting 2.0, and how much of podcasting 2.0 needs to be incorporated into something before it's before it's a thing. So one of the really tedious, boring, and technical things about podcasting 2.0 is that there is a tag in there called locked. And it works in the same way as a domain name. It basically means that no one can come and, or it should mean that no one can come and copy your podcast, stick it on another podcast host, and divert all of your traffic over there. And that has happened in the past. And there's a little tag called the podcast locked tag. Now that is supported now by the majority of podcast hosts. If you look at it in terms of volume of new episodes. So all of the big podcast hosts like Buzzsprout, like Libsyn, are all supporting this podcast locked tag, and are many of the smaller ones. And so arguably you could say, well, podcasting 2.0 is already there. Yes, but only for that one little tag.
Right.
And there are lots of other tags to go. So it's not quite an easy question, but I do believe that as podcasting 2.0 grows, as different things grow, particularly things like transcripts, closed captions,
Correct.
that sort of thing, I'm sure that we'll see much, much more of that happening in the big apps. It's only a year old. Podcasting's been going for 15 times that, so it's not going to happen overnight.
No, and I think one of the things that I hear you talk a lot about, and I agree with, was the apps. There are so many different apps out there, and I think the tendency is that we go to the big guys, Spotify and Apple, which is what I used to do with Spotify. But then I heard your show one time, and I think I downloaded Pocketcast, and I think it's one of the best. I just think it is one of the best user interface. The quality of the interface and what you can do with it is amazing. The show is not sponsored by Pocketcast, just to let you know that. Just want to let everybody know that as well too. It's not. But why is it so important that not just podcasters, but I think those who are, well, maybe it is of course it's important for podcasters, but it's important for podcasters to educate people as well on all of the other interfaces, all the other apps that are out there, because it just has to be to their benefit if they do it that way.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty about podcasting is that it's open. So you don't need, with a few exceptions, you don't need a specific app for a specific podcast. So that's the real, that's the real benefit in terms of where podcasting has come from. If we give too much control to one large company, then that's bad for the overall the overall future of podcasting. And so actually it's a good thing that at the moment we are in a state where Spotify is roughly a third of all listens. Apple Podcasts is roughly a third of all listens. And then the other third is all kinds of other apps in there as well. Pocketcasts and many others of them. And I think that's a really healthy place to be, because there isn't one company that owns podcasting. There isn't one company that will automatically start closing the industry. And it's important for us as creators that our content is available on as many places as possible. I used to work in the radio industry and still do, kind of. And one of the things about radio is the only way that you get onto the radio is if you found a radio station which has an FCC license, so already it's difficult. Secondly, to talk to that radio station and try and convince them that you are the sort of person that they want on that radio station. And then thirdly, in many cases, you need to comply with all kinds of radio station policies. You need to comply with FCC rules. You need to comply with all kinds of different things. So what you get on that radio station isn't really you. It's you through the lens of how the radio station wants its shows to sound and everything else. And so what podcasting does is it gets rid of all of that stuff, and it allows me, someone who puts a podcast together every single day in a rental apartment, to be on the same platform as the Daily from the New York Times or Joe Rogan or Freakonomics or whatever it might be. And that's a really exciting thing. We shouldn't lose that. What I'm excited about in terms of Pocketcasts particularly is they were bought last year by Automatic, which is the company that owns WordPress. Automatic, I think, have rather more money than their previous shareholders did in terms of being able to invest in that product. And so I'm quite hopeful that we see Pocketcasts both begin to release more features and also begin to pull in more Podcasting 2.0 features into their product. Things like transcripts and chapters and all of that stuff would be really helpful to be pulling that in and to make that the best of breed podcast app, because possibly it'll take longer for Apple or for Spotify to end up doing that.
No, agreed. I was listening to YouTuber MKBHD, Marquez Brownlee, and I was listening to it on Pocketcast, and the video portion came up for his podcast. And I happened to be driving because I was just listening to it, but I looked over at the phone and I see the video that was actually displaying as and I didn't know that it actually had that capability until it actually happened. And so when I think about the growth of what podcasting has and what we're trying to do, and then you think about the apps, the role that the apps play, it's intricate, and it's almost like hand in glove. And we need to make sure, I think, as podcasters, that we are helping these app developers by giving them information and giving them some data, like yourself as well, just so that way we can actually continue to percolate, throughout the industry around what it is that we're trying to do and we're trying to communicate. So love it, man. Love it.
I'm really bullish about the future of Pocketcast. I should say to Jessica Louise, who's watching us from Melbourne in Australia. Oh, look, there you go. I should say that Pocketcast is actually a proud Australian podcast app. It comes from Adelaide, where everything is half an hour later than you think it's going to be. So I think that's really good to also see a good Australian company doing really well as well.
Agreed. I mean, good on you, mate. That's all I got. That's the only thing I know. That's it. That's in a New York accent.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, James, what are your thoughts on? I know, What was the thing we were talking about? Like when we first, what was it? Oh my gosh, super or something like that. We were just talking about the different words of what it meant, and
because I moved here, you can tell that I'm a Brit, and I moved here 5 years or so ago, 6 years now. And there are lots of things that are the same. We've got lots of British TV, lots of American TV, as you would expect here, and all of that. But then there are lots of things which are completely different. And two of the things that are really different are any part of language to talk about finance, and any part of language to talk about prescription drugs and things like that. All of the brand names are different. So I've got no idea what I'm asking for when I go into a chemist or a pharmacist. And similarly, I was told that I had to put money into a super. I had no idea what a super was. It turns out to be short for superannuation, which I would have called in my old country a pension. Which you probably call, I don't know, 401k or something. There you go. So yes, it's a different world when it comes to finance language when it comes to prescription drugs, and it used to be very different when it came to coffee. But I think everybody understands what a flat white is now. So
I would
so it's
hope
probably
so.
okay.
I would hope so. The world will go crazy if they don't know what a flat white is. They need to figure that out. Before we, I wanted to finish up the conversation with this one question around: do you think the FCC rules may regulate it into the podcast industry? That's a great question.
It is a great question. I don't see there being the benefit of. So there are some FCC rules which are already regulated in. Podcasting is subject to the same laws that exist in other parts of life. And if you do, if you're promoting things which are illegal on your podcast, then you're already breaking the rules. So the FCC doesn't need to be jumping in there. The reason why the FCC does a very, good is a subjective thing. But the reason why the FCC is regulating things like broadcast media,
Mm-hmm.
TV, and radio is that it's a finite space. There's a finite amount of radio stations that you can put onto FM or AM. It's a finite amount of TV stations that you can put onto free-to-air TV. And so therefore, that's why it's regulated. It's regulated because it's a public space and it needs to be used correctly. That's not the case when it comes to podcasts. So I don't think that FCC regulation or the equivalent in other countries, CRTC regulation in Canada, God help you, you really don't want that, or Ofcom regulation in the UK. I don't think it's relevant because actually it isn't a public space that we're on. There's, of course, been a lot of discussion recently about Joe Rogan on Spotify, and before that, Alex Jones on Apple Podcasts and other things as well. At the end of the day, podcast directories, some of them can be closed, some of them can make their own business decisions on whether or not they want that content in their platform. That's up to them. They're private businesses. There are other ways of getting hold of podcasts, but of course, the important thing around RSS feeds is that if you know the RSS feed of a podcast, you can subscribe to it on pretty well any podcast player anyway. So it's kind of immaterial if somebody has blocked you from a directory or something because of what you end up saying. So I'm not too concerned about FCC regulation, and I don't think that they have any particular interest in it more than they already regulate this particular space anyway.
Excellent. And then Jessica says, and they speak nicely in in Adelaide.
In Adelaide, yes. Well, Jessica, the one good thing that they produce in South Australia is Cooper's beer, which is very excellent. If you can buy it in the US somewhere, it'll probably be in the foreign aisle. But if you can buy it in the US, Cooper's Green, I would recommend. It's my daily go-to.
And then White Label American Podcast says, wait, is James saying that Pocketcast will have a feature for transcripts, or will be up to the podcaster? Just what he just uploaded on Pocketcast.
Yeah, great question. So the way that transcripts currently work is there's no standard whatsoever. And if you want to do a transcript, then you end up having to do it on your website or something and then link to that. There are some podcast apps which will automatically create transcripts for you, but that's about as far as it goes. The Podcasting 2.0 work includes transcripts and closed captions that are part of the RSS feed and therefore can appear in your podcast player, in your podcast app of choice. If you use a podcast app called Podfriend, which you'll find if you just do a web search for it, then you will see that transcripts appear directly within that particular app. So that's a great thing. Pocketcasts could do that. They could implement those new tags so that transcripts from you appear within their app. Or there is quite a lot of work going on, particularly with Spotify and with Apple at the moment, where they are actually producing transcripts automatically for your show. They just don't show them, but they produce them automatically to help people search for them and find them and all of that sort of thing. And so from that point of view, they may surface those in the the future, that may be the right thing to do from a podcaster's point of view, or indeed it might not be. But transcripts is, I think, a really interesting place, particularly in terms of accessibility.
Excellent. And this is a good segue question. Hey, James, what are your thoughts on Spotify acquiring pod sites and Chartable? Great segue question, Gabby. I appreciate that.
It is. Yes. My dog is very concerned about something outside.
That's okay. That's all right.
Come and get a bit of toast. Come and get a bit of toast. There you go. Toast and Vegemite. That's what you need. There you are. You have that and shush. So this was news today, news that broke only a few hours ago. Spotify has bought two different companies. Why buy one when you can buy two that do the same sort of job, Podsites and Chartable? Both of these companies are really interesting in the technology that they offer. So you're there listening to a podcast, you hear an ad for Geico in your podcast, and you go, "Oh, I could do with some insurance with a creepy gecko trying to sell me insurance. I will go to Geico and I will buy the insurance." Now, up until now, there's been no way of knowing whether that new customer to Geico was a new customer because they heard that particular ad in a podcast. And that's what both Podsites and Chartable do. That's the technology that they offer podcasters. And Spotify has bought both of those companies. They'll be merging both of those, as I understand it, into, well, they're certainly merging Chartable into the Megaphone product that they have, which is a big podcast host. It looks as if Podsites is going to be held separately for now, but I'm a bit confused by that, to be honest. So I need to do a little bit more digging there. But that's great news for Spotify. You might look at it and go, well, that's Spotify taking over even more of the podcast industry, and is that a good thing? The one thing that I would tell you is that I've had a lot of podcast publishers tell me that they don't want to be, for example, in the Triton Digital Podcast Ranker, which is a big ranker that comes out every single month. They don't want to be in there because Triton is owned by iHeartRadio, and they are a competitor to iHeartRadio. And so therefore, why would they want to give all of their data to a competitor? And similarly, I suspect that we'll see a bunch of publishers who are at the moment currently with Podsites or with Chartable saying, well, actually, I don't want to be giving all of my data now to Podsites or Chartable, so I'll have to go and find a third-party company instead. So I'm sure that we'll be seeing a little bit of that going on. But, it's good news for advertisers. Maybe good news for podcasting as a whole, because at least it will show how popular podcast advertising can be and how it can really drive results for businesses, which is an important thing too.
Excellent. Well, let's stay on the Spotify thing for a second here. Now, one of the things that I've heard you speak about too, and I think it's a question that a lot of people are having around these celebrity podcasters, right? As they move into this podcast world where the regular podcaster gets up, Saturday mornings or Sunday nights or whatever, and they're recording, and their, sweat, blood, and tears are going into it. They publish, and they get 15 downloads. And then you have, the quote unquote, celebrities that come into the industry, and, they do a 15-minute, 30-minute episode, and they're getting 30,000 downloads per episode. And it almost seems unfair. But what's your take on the celebrity podcast? Is it good for the industry, or is it something that we're going to see kind of fade out?
I think we're already beginning to see it fade out a little bit. I mean, what we saw, of course, in the middle of the pandemic was that all of these celebrities who would normally be schmoozing around, doing all kinds of things, flying on their private jets and filming on movies and all of this stuff, were stuck at home and they couldn't do anything. And then their agent said, why don't you do a podcast? And so that's basically why we saw so many celebrity podcasts over the last 18 months or so. That is clearly going down now. You say that celebrity podcasts all do very well, 30,000 downloads and that sort of thing per episode. I'm not sure that's the case. And what I think we're actually seeing is we're seeing companies like Spotify and Stitcher and Amazon and many others throwing an awful lot against the wall and seeing what sticks. And most of these new shows won't go anywhere. Joe Rogan has been podcasting for more than 10 years. That's
Correct.
one of the reasons why he's so successful. And my guess is that, out of 50 shows, one might be really good. One might be the smart list of celebrity podcasting. And the other 49, we're not going to mention because, frankly, we don't know their names because they're simply not good enough. So that's where I think we are in terms of celebrity podcasts. The problem with a celebrity podcast is that celebrities, quite a lot of celebrities, are celebrities because they have sparkling scripts written for them by Hollywood scriptwriters. They come over as being incredibly funny, incredibly quick-witted and everything else. And the only good thing that a celebrity has actually managed to do is to go to drama school, learn how to act, and then remember a script. And when you put them in front of a microphone and you say, go, talk to all of your friends, make some interesting audio. Actually, most of them don't know how to do it.
Yes.
And I think that shows actually that podcasting is rather harder than we think it is.
Agreed.
It's rather harder to come up with, decent interview questions, to, have an arc on, I do an awful lot of moderating at conferences, and that's a lot of hard work to work out exactly how you're going to introduce people, exactly how you're going to make sure that everybody gets their say, exactly, what how the conversation is going to move from subject to subject to subject and everything else. And it's not as easy as just rocking up and having a conversation. And I think that that's something that we kind of forget about.
Agreed. And the last topic that I wanted to cover before we get out of here was just around the idea of international growth, right? You touched upon it a little bit earlier when you started talking about the difference between Apple and Spotify, iPhone versus Android. And I think, of course, I myself being over here in the States, right, it's just all about the iPhone. And we don't even realize that there's that a lot of times that there's actually another phone that's out there that's actually doing well. That's like more, it's almost like us. I am a big, so we call it soccer, but I call it football. Just like the rest of the other world does. But of course, we're Americans. So you know what? We want to call it soccer, so we're going to call it soccer. But the rest of the world calls it football. There you go. It's the same thing with the iPhone, I think. It's the iPhone or be damned. And so but from a content standpoint, I know there's a lot of people, I talk to them all the time. They want to kind of grow their podcast internationally. They want to be on those charts and that chartable thing. I've ranked in, in the UK or the Jamaica or wherever it is. But I don't know if there's a secret sauce, or what should they be focused on to help grow their podcast from an international standpoint?
Okay, well, so there are a couple of things there. Podcast charts, by the way, have nothing to do with downloads.
Come on.
Nothing to do with downloads. So, so therefore, we can come back to podcast charts if you like. But in terms of iPhone versus Android splits, for example, in the US, it's actually 50-50, iPhone, Android. Typically, what we see in the US is that iPhones are owned by people who have money, and Android phones are owned by people who have less money. And that's typically what we see, although that's not fully the case. But that appears to be the case. When you start looking at other countries, particularly into Northern Europe, then you can see that Android has 70-80% of the market, and an iPhone's far, far smaller. The Czech Republic, for example, I did some some numbers around that, and the iPhone has, I think, a 17% market share in that country. So it's really important for you to be promoting your podcast on things that aren't Apple Podcasts in those countries. That may be Spotify for you. That may be many other ways. And there are different podcast apps in different countries as well, which you should be aware of. So if you podcast in Spanish, you'll already know about eVoox, which is a big Spanish or Catalan podcast app that's very, very popular. There are really popular podcast apps in India where there are 125 million English speakers. You should be there. It's free to get in them. One is called Gaana, Gaana, and one of them is called JioSaavn. And those two, well worth getting into, because your podcast will reach a massive, massive audience in there, particularly if you're around business and entrepreneurship and stuff like that. So focusing on getting the right apps is important. Promoting the right thing is important. And the other thing, and you alluded to it earlier when you were talking about sport, when you were talking about football. The other thing is just being aware of the differences between your culture and other parts of culture throughout the rest of the world. If I'm talking about the best way to save for your super, then you're not going to understand it. People in the UK aren't going to understand it. People in Ireland aren't going to understand it. But if I talk about saving for your retirement, we'll all understand it.
Correct.
Because I'm not using that piece of very local jargon. It's not quite the same for Americans, because obviously American culture is available throughout the world. But I think it's just worthwhile, bearing that sort of side of it in mind. The other thing, just to mention, is that in terms of podcasts, the fastest growing podcasts by language at the moment are in Hindi and in Indonesian. English is way down on the amount of growth of podcasts going on at the moment. So we're actually seeing a large amount of growth of podcasts in other countries. And what you can do is you can work with a local podcast studio to take the podcasts that you have and to either do a translation job, or better, to do a translation, but a culturally aware translation job into other languages for other cultures as well. And I think we forget just how large places like Southeast Asia are in terms of people, in terms of just numbers of listeners. There's a real opportunity there, and I think we should focus an awful lot on that.
Wow, you just blew my mind around having your podcast translated into, just say, Hindi, for instance, but culturally aware verbiage, all of those different things. I have never thought about it in that context of like maybe taking an episode and just trying out an episode and seeing what that looks like as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, don't forget, of course, that places like India, 125 million English speakers. You'll do pretty well on the English as well, as long as your shows are findable, as long as your shows have the right keywords and stuff like that. Make sure that they're in the episode title more than anything else, because that's what most podcast apps will search through. But I know people who've seen 25% or so. Growth in those, just by adding their shows to those particular apps. Jessica Louise is asking for those names again. One of them is called GeoSavan, and one of them is called Ghana. But I would recommend instead going to podnews.net and searching for the phrase podcast directories, because you will find a list of every single podcast directory that you can be in, and it includes those two and an awful lot more, and the links that you need to take you straight to the page where you can submit those particular shows. There are loads of podcast directories out there. Another one, for example, is a little app called PodLP, which is an app that runs on KaiOS phones. KaiOS phones are phones which cost $10, and they are incredibly popular in many parts of Africa, many parts of India. Incredibly popular there. They run on a completely different operating system, but being in PodLP, making sure that you are that you're visible in that particular app will get you many more listeners, in there as well. So it's all of those additional podcast directories which are really important. But you'll find that list and many others. If you go to podnews.net, you can click on the articles link and you'll find it in the middle of there.
Excellent. One last big question. In the next 18 months, what's something that you see taking place within the podcast industry? I know there's probably a whole bunch of them.
I think we will see an awful lot more consolidation. And we've seen more of that today with Spotify purchasing those analytics companies. I think that we'll see, consolidation going on, with other people as well. And certainly Amazon seems to have deep pockets at the moment. iHeartRadio appears to have worked out how to spend money again instead of just lose it. So that's a good thing too. So I think all of that is worthwhile keeping an eye on. But I think also the other thing just to keep an eye on is different ways of earning revenue from your podcasting. That may be advertising, but it may also be a bunch of other things as well, whether it's value for value, whether it's live shows and all of that kind of stuff. If I was a betting man, I would also say looking at fiction drama rather than just interview shows. I suspect that fiction drama will really grow over the next year or so, partially because that's real IP that you can take to TV shows and TV companies and movie companies, but also partially because that stuff's evergreen. That stuff never goes off. So if you use dynamic ad insertion to change the ads that you get, depending on when you download that show, then those shows will be, whatever the phrase is, smart passive income. They will always be sitting there earning revenue for you. You have a look at how many people are still downloading Serial to this day. They're downloading it because it was a great show and it doesn't go out of date, particularly. I think Adnan is still in prison. So it doesn't go out of date particularly. And so therefore, that is still doing really, really well for them. MailChimp must be pinching themselves at the great deal that they ended up getting. And so I suspect that we will see much more of that sort of evergreen podcast stuff happening. And yes, there will be more interview shows and stuff like that. But I think, more involved content is going to be really interesting to see.
Excellent. And TV companies are starting to use, I think I'm seeing it, is that they're starting to use podcasts as kind of a litmus test for potential TV shows, things like that.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, they're using it for two ways. Firstly, to test new stories and new ideas for shows, and also they're using it the other way. They're using it as ways of getting their audiences to focus a little bit more on the TV shows that they already have. Apple, HBO, Netflix are all doing what they call companion podcasts. So those are podcasts that come out at the same time as the TV show and allows you to go deeper into that particular show, and hopefully keeps that viewer as a viewer who's watching that show for rather a lot longer.
Yeah, the companion podcast. All right, I'm going to respect your time. We could have gone into so many different areas, but I just want to thank you so much for being on Podcasters Live, James. I know your schedule is super busy, and you're going to be at Podcast Movement coming up in March, correct?
I am, yes. Super looking forward to. That's when this shirt gets its next outing at Podcast Movement Evolutions in LA. Super looking forward to that because that'll be the first time that I've been able to get on a plane for 2 years. And I should tell you, Steve, my airline misses me so much. It started sending me the in-flight magazine to my house. That's how much Qantas missed me. So bless them. But I'm looking forward to getting on a plane next month, which would be a real thrill.
They're like, James, we're so happy to see you again. Oh my gosh, James.
Well, I'm hoping they say that because I'm still flying economy. So I'm hoping that they say that.
Hey, man, they may bump you up. You never know when you get there and they see your name. They're like, oh, that's the guy. Let's go ahead and bump him up. Let's go ahead and bump him up. Yeah, that's the guy. Well, this is another good one to kind of close out. And I appreciate that this has been one of the best conversations that I've been exposed to. So much knowledge and info to work with. Thank you for this, James and Steve. Awesome. And then Jessica, I enjoyed this very much. Thanks, gents. It felt like a masterclass. I got a lot out of it. Excellent. That's exactly what we want. That's exactly what we want to hear.
Feedback is a good thing. And I should say, by the way, Podcasting 2.0, one of the things that they're working on is cross-app comments. Yeah. So in the same way as we're getting comments from a lot of different devices here on this system, That's what they're currently working on for podcasts as well. And so maybe in the future, maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, maybe less, then you'll actually see lots and lots of comments associated with podcast episodes and stuff in the future. And won't that be a good thing?
It will.
Really looking forward to that.
Excellent.
Steve, thank you
Excellent.
so much. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I hope to do so again one day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, stay in the green room for a second while I close this out. 1 second. Oh my gosh. Wow. What a conversation. There are too many things for me to kind of go into and list off. You're just going to have to look at the replay, and you're going to have to leave some comments or some questions for us if there's anything that we didn't cover or didn't make sense, but I find that hard to believe. I want to thank James Cridland for being on Podcasters Live. His schedule is so tight, but he allowed us to kind of pick his brain around everything from downloads, trends, Spotify, international growth, you name it. And this is what we try to do with Podcasters Live. We try to help podcasters understand a little bit more about the industry, but more importantly, how they can actually grow their community using technology, using different platforms. So we actually enjoyed having different people on here, such as James Cridland as well. So we want to thank you for listening to us. If you want to learn more about Podcasters Live, you can just go right to our website, podcasterslive.com, and make sure you click that link if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, and hit that bell so that way you don't miss anything else. We have an amazing lineup kind of coming up for the rest of actually March and all the way into April as well. So as we always say, have a great night and God bless.